I reconvene our hearing. I gave my opening statement yesterday. I don't have anything to add to it, but I got a few housekeeping things to take care of. I'm disappointed that the 2-hour rule was invoked to shut down this hearing before we could hear from Mr. Browder's testimony yesterday. Mr. Browder has traveled from overseas to be here today to testify about Russia's efforts to manipulate our government and media. This is an important topic to discuss. If the other party is truly serious about getting to the bottom of the Russian interference, they should hear him out. Mr. Browder, I thank you very much for changing your travel plans to be here. This committee very much appreciates your willingness to stay over a day. I'm going to introduce items into the record, 3 in number. The first is a statement by the president of the Human Rights Foundation. In it, he alleges that he and others uncovered a $2 billion corruption scheme involving Venezuela government and a foreign company laundering money through J.P. Morgan. He claims that the foreign company hired Fusion GPS, which then created dossiers containing false information to smear the whistleblowers involved, planted slanderous news items, and intimidated journalists who were going to report on the corruption scheme. The second item is an article by Lee Smith titled "Fusion GPS Illustrates the Brave New World of Manufactured News for Hire," end of quote. The third item is a New York Times article titled "Soviet Veteran Who Met with Trump Jr. is a Master of Dark Arts," end of quote. That article describes the activities of a Russian-American lobbyist named in Mr. Browder's Foreign Agents Registration Act complaint. So without objection, those would be included in the record. I would like to introduce into the record Senator Krapel has a constituent who would like to submit written testimony about his experience with Fusion GPS for the record. Without objection, he may do so within 1 week from today. I also want to insert a letter from Airline Pilots Association alleging that the U.S. Travel Association has not properly registered under FARA. That letter alleges the association engaged in political activities on behalf of foreign state-owned airlines in the Middle East. So without objection, I will do that. And now I'll let the ranking member make any statement she has, and then I will introduce and swear our witness. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Today, our committee continues its examination of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Yesterday, we heard from government experts, representatives from the Justice Department and the FBI, along with DOJ's Inspector General. That discussion, I believe, confirmed that there is a significant problem with under-enforcement of the law. Individuals who lobby and engage in political activities on behalf of foreign governments and interests in the United States do not register that in a way that works with the Justice Department. And this is because right now there are no real consequences for failing to register, and I think we should change that. As we also heard yesterday, the Justice Department relies heavily on finding out about potential violations by monitoring press reporting and other public information. At times, the department also receives complaints alleging that individuals or companies have failed to register their lobbying and other political activities on behalf of foreign interests. Today, we will hear from one such individual, William Browder. I do not know Mr. Browder, but it's my understanding that in July 2016, he filed a FARA complaint alleging that a number of individuals failed to register their Russian-backed lobbying efforts against the Magnitsky Act and the global Magnitsky Act. Among those named in Mr. Browder's campaign is the Russian lawyer Natalia Veselnitskaya. As we all know, Ms. Veselnitskaya met with the Trump campaign on June 9, 2016, with the understanding that she would offer incriminating information on Hillary Clinton, the campaign's opponent in the president's election. It is my understanding that Mr. Browder is very familiar with Ms. Veselnitskaya and Renat Akhmetchin, another Russian figure who attended the June 9th meeting because of their work to oppose the Magnitsky Acts. While Mr. Browder does not have firsthand knowledge of what happened on June 9, his experience with these specific individuals and his broader understanding of how the Russian government operates may well advance the committee's understanding of what motivated that meeting. At least I hope it will. And so I look forward to hearing from our witness today, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. I will first introduce Mr. Browder, CEO of Hermitage Capital, an investment firm based in London. In 2007, Russian government officials and members of organized crime engaged in corporate identity theft, stole the corporate identity of 3 Hermitage companies, and used them fraudulently, obtaining $230 million. Hermitage filed a criminal complaint with Russian law enforcement. In response, the Russian government assigned the case to the very Russian officials involved in the crime. Mr. Magnitsky, Mr. Browder's lawyer, and the one who uncovered the fraud, was eventually jailed and died under very suspicious circumstances. Mr. Browder worked to get the U.S. Congress to pass the Magnitsky Act to authorize the president to sanction Russian officials involved in this and other human rights abuses. Would you please stand, sir? And do you swear? No, let me start over again. Do you affirm that the testimony you're about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Thank you for your affirmation. I would like to have you take 7 minutes if you can, or if, but we would like to save time for questions. So let's say 7 or 8 minutes, and then we'll ask you questions.
Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Feinstein, distinguished members of the committee, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to tell my story about the Russian campaign, the Vladimir Putin campaign to repeal the Magnitsky Act in Washington, D.C. I'm Bill Browder. I'm the founder and CEO of Hermitage Capital Management. My firm was once the largest foreign investment advisor in Russia. In that capacity, we discovered massive corruption in the companies that we invested in. To fight that corruption, we started to research how the oligarchs went about doing the stealing in these companies, and then shared that research with the international media. This naming and shaming campaign had some positive effect on the share price of the companies, and it was also made Russia a better place for some period of time. But as you can imagine, exposing billions of dollars of malfeasance upset the people who were benefiting from that malfeasance. And those people had very close connections with the Putin regime. In November of 2005, I was expelled from the country. I was declared a threat to national security in response to my anti-corruption activities. In June of 2007, my Moscow office was raided by 25 officers from the Moscow Interior Ministry. 25 more officers raided the office of my American law firm, Firestone Duncan. In those raids, they sought to get the stamp seals and certificates for our investment holding companies. And with those stamp seals and certificates, they were able to conduct a corporate identity theft. At that point, I hired the smartest lawyer I knew in Russia, a young man named Sergei Magnitsky. He was 35 years old, to investigate who did what and how we could stop them. Sergei went out investigated and came back with an astounding conclusion. The conclusion he came back with was that the purpose of stealing our companies was to try to steal our assets, which they didn't succeed in doing. However, they did succeed in stealing $230 million of taxes that we paid to the Russian government from the Russian government. And so I should point out that the theft wasn't of my money or my firm's money, but it was of the Russian government's money, $230 million. It was the largest tax refund fraud in the history of Russia. Sergei and I were both convinced that this must be a rogue operation. We thought that Putin was a nationalist, that Putin wouldn't have allowed his own officials to steal from his own country. And we figured if we brought it to the attention of the highest authorities in Russia, then the good guys would get the bad guys, and that would be the end of the story. And so we wrote criminal complaints to every different branch of the Russian justice system. I went to the newspapers, and Sergei gave sworn testimony to the Russian State Investigative Committee, which is their version of the FBI. And we waited for the good guys to get the bad guys. It turned out that in Putin's Russia, there are no good guys. On November 24th, 2008, about 6 weeks after Sergei testified against a bunch of corrupt officials, some of the same officials he testified against came to his home at 8 in the morning in front of his wife and 2 children, arrested him, they put him in pretrial detention, and where he was then tortured to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no heat and no window panes in December in Moscow, so he nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. They'd move him from cell to cell to cell in the middle of the night. The purpose of this was to get him to withdraw his testimony and to get him to sign a false confession that he stole the $230 million and did so in my instructions. And Sergei refused to do that. Because he refused, the pressure just increased, and after 6 months, his health deteriorated. He developed terrible pains in his stomach, he lost 40 pounds, and he was diagnosed as having pancreatitis and gallstones and needing an operation, which was scheduled for the 1st of August, 2009. A week before his operation, they abruptly moved him from a prison that had medical facilities to a maximum security prison called Butyrka, considered to be one of the most awful prisons in Russia, and most significantly for Sergei, there were no medical facilities there. At Butyrka, his health completely broke down. He went into constant, agonizing, ear-piercing pain from his pancreatitis, and they refused him medical treatment. Sergei and his lawyers wrote 20 different requests, desperate requests for medical attention. All of the requests were either ignored, in some cases denied in writing. After a couple of months of this horrible torture, Sergei's body could no longer hold out. And on the night of November 16th, Sergei Magnitsky went into critical condition. On that night, the Butyrka authorities didn't want to have responsibility for him, so they put him in an ambulance, sent him to a different prison that had medical facilities. But when he arrived at that different prison, instead of putting him in the emergency room, they put him in an isolation cell. He was chained to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat him until he died. Sergei Magnitsky was 37 years old. He left a wife and 2 children. I got the news of his murder the morning of the 17th, and I've made it my life's work since then to get justice for Sergei Magnitsky. Unfortunately, justice was impossible to get in Russia. They circled the wagons and exonerated everybody involved, gave promotions and state honors to the people who were most complicit. So I sought justice outside of Russia, and I came here to Washington. I told Senator Benjamin Cardin and Senator John McCain the same story I'm sharing with you today, and they came up with the Magnitsky Act to freeze assets and ban visas of the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky and the people who commit other gross human rights abuses in Russia. The Magnitsky Act passed 92-4 in the Senate, 89% of the House of Representatives, and was signed into law on the 14th of December 2012. President Putin was absolutely infuriated by this, and he then, in retaliation, banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families. That ban was the reason why he took such a drastic step was because Vladimir Putin was one of the beneficiaries of the $230 million fraud. We've since traced some of that money to an account of a man named Sergei Roldugin, who's been exposed in the Panama Papers as being one of his nominees. Vladimir Putin was so infuriated at the Magnitsky Act that he then put Sergei Magnitsky on trial 3 years after they killed him in the first ever trial against a dead man in the history of Russia, and put me on trial as his co-defendant, finding us both guilty. In addition to that, a number of people have been killed in connection with this whole Magnitsky case. There are 7 people who have died either from murder or suspicious circumstances, and there's a number of other attempted murders. For example, Boris Nemtsov, who was one of our allies in fighting for justice for Magnitsky and coming to Congress here, coming to the European Parliament, he was murdered in front of, coming to these organizations to lobby for the Magnitsky Act, was murdered in front of the Kremlin in 2015. His protege, Vladimir Kara-Murza, was poisoned within an inch of his life. He went into critical condition. He was in coma. He had multiple organ failure from the poison and barely survived. The Magnitsky family lawyer, Nikolai Gorokov, was thrown off a 4th floor balcony right before he was supposed to testify in court about this. And I've had numerous threats from all up and down the Russian government for my own life. It's not just death threats. It's also, or I should say, not just violence that the Russian government does, but it's also what I call political violence. And the political violence came in the form of a massive campaign that the Russian government, via Natalia Veselnitskaya, launched here in Washington. She organized a number of individuals to come to Washington and lobby and basically tell a false story that Sergei Magnitsky wasn't murdered, he wasn't a whistleblower, in order to have the Magnitsky Act repealed. She engaged Rinat Akhmetshin. She engaged Glenn Simpson from Fusion GPS. She engaged Chris Cooper from Potomac Strategies. She engaged Ron Dellums. She engaged a number of other people. And the purpose of the engagement was to withdraw or to repeal the Magnitsky Act and withdraw Sergei Magnitsky's name from the global Magnitsky Act. In addition to it being effectively a campaign for me. Oh. I'll be done in 1 second. In addition to it being a campaign to effectively cover up a murder, it was also...
Can you just ask the year that she came and did this?
The question is, you can still finish your statement, but right now, would you ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Mr.
Yeah, I'm sorry I've gone over, but I've got like two...
We're not going to stop you.
When Veselnitskaya came to this country, what year was that?
I believe that she came to this country in 2014.
Thank you.
Okay, continue.
Sorry, I've gone over, but I'm just about done. In addition to this being morally reprehensible, it's also none of these people registered as agents, foreign agents, under the Foreign Agent Registration Act. And so my firm put together a complaint to the Department of Justice where we listed out what they did, who did what, and the fact that they weren't registered with the Foreign Agent Registration Act, and filed that in July of 2016. And I'm here today to tell the story, to clarify any of the details, because I believe that the fact that these people were able to run around on Putin's agenda and without any transparency about who they were working for is something that needs to stop in the future. And I think that the rules governing this thing should be strengthened. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your testimony. And yesterday I announced we were going to have 7-minute rounds of discussion. We cut that back to 5 because of the 2-hour rule, so each member will have 7 minutes. Mr. Browder, in your written statement, you said that the Russian lawyer who met with Trump campaign officials had hired Glenn Simpson of Fusion GPS through the law firm of Baker Hostler to conduct a smear campaign against you and Mr. Magnitsky. You said that Simpson contacted a number of major newspapers to spread false information. Mr. Simpson told the media he only did some research as litigation support. Propaganda and publicity work for a foreign principal requires registration as a foreign agent, so it's important to understand whether Mr. Simpson was pushing negative information about you in the media. So I have several questions along this line. Could you explain exactly how Mr. Simpson manipulated the media to smear you and undermine the Magnitsky Act, and how do you know about that?
So, yes, so Glenn Simpson was calling a number of journalists, pitching a story to the journalists as the Magnitsky Act was being debated in Congress. The story that he was pitching was that Sergei Magnitsky had not been murdered, but he died of natural causes, that Sergei Magnitsky wasn't a whistleblower, that he was a criminal, and that the story that I had told the U.S. Congress was incorrect about Magnitsky, and therefore the Magnitsky Act should be repealed. Yeah. That was the story he was pitching. I know that he was pitching that story because a number of journalists who were pitched by him came to me to ask me about it. He was unsuccessful for the most part in getting that story written, but that doesn't take away from the fact that he was trying to get that story published. And that is not litigation support. It's impossible for me to see how it could be litigation support because had those stories been written and during the litigation that he was supposed to be supporting, any juror who had read those stories would have been disqualified from being on the jury. And so that could only have been for the purpose of manipulating and trying to change legislation here in Washington.
Your complaint and your testimony today have outlined a multi-pronged effort by this group of unregistered foreign agents. Were they working together in a coordinated campaign, or were these separate, isolated efforts, and how do you know? And then what basis do you have for believing that Fusion GPS's efforts were in the interest of the Russian government rather than in the interests of Prevzon Holdings?
To answer your first question, this entire effort was under the auspices of Natalia Veselnitskaya. She was one organizing it. It was a highly resourced operation. It was being paid for by her client, which was the Kotsev family of Russia. The Kotsev family were paying the bills. Pyotr Kotsev, who is the patriarch of the Kotsev family, is a senior Russian government official. He was the former transport minister of the Moscow region, which is a region the size of France. He's currently a vice president of Russian Railways, which is the second most important state company after Gazprom, and he's a senior member of the Putin regime. In terms of, could you repeat the second part of your question?
Yeah. What basis do you have for believing Fusion GPS's efforts were in the interest of the Russian government rather than the interests of Prevzon Holdings?
The work that Fusion GPS was doing to repeal the Magnitsky Act couldn't have had any benefit to Prevzon Holdings because Prevzon Holdings was under investigation by the Department of Justice for specific money laundering statutes, and even if even if they had been successful in repealing the Magnitsky Act, which is a 1 in a million shot, even if they had been successful, it wouldn't have had any bearing on the case against them by the Department of Justice. And therefore, it's hard to see how that could have in any way been supporting a litigation as opposed to trying to change a policy.
Okay. There have been media reports alleging that some of the stolen Magnitsky money went to a Russian investment bank firm called Renaissance Capital. What can you tell us about that, and what is Renaissance Capital's connection, if any, with the Russian government?
Renaissance Capital is a Russian investment bank. It was headed by, at the time of this crime, by a man named Stephen Jennings, a New Zealander who lives in London. And he was the CEO. The chairman was, or I should say another senior official, was a British citizen of Russian origin named Igor Sigurian. On their staff at Renaissance Capital, they trumpeted the fact that they had a number of former FSB officers on their staff. I should point out that there's no such thing as a former FSB officer. It's a lifetime commitment. And in the Department of Justice investigation into Prevzon Holdings, they determined that $13 million from the crime that Sergei Magnitsky uncovered, exposed, and was killed over went to the bank accounts of Renaissance Capital in the United Kingdom.
I think you said this, but let me make sure about Renaissance Capital's connection, if any, with the Russian government.
So Renaissance Capital is connected to the Russian government through ex-FSB employees who are at the senior level of Renaissance Capital.
Okay. This issue is also important to the committee. That same Russian bank, Renaissance Capital, paid President Bill Clinton $500,000 for a June 2010 speech in Moscow. That same month, Uranium One began the application process for a Russian government-owned company to acquire U.S. uranium assets. The review of this takeover was done by the Committee of Foreign Investments, and Secretary Clinton's State Department was one of the approval authorities. Renaissance Capital reportedly assigned a buy rating to Uranium One, so it raises a number of issues. My last question, with 26 seconds left, but you can take what time you need to answer. Did you meet with anyone from the Justice Department when you filed your FARA complaint in 2016? If so, who initiated the meeting, you or them? Did the Justice Department ever follow up with you on the information that you provided in your complaint and its appendices, or let you know whether they had acted on your complaint?
I had two contacts with the Justice Department. One was a conference call with the head of the FARA division and her subordinates, and then the other was a in-person meeting here in Washington to follow up on the complaint. In both instances, it was initiated by my firm, and other than providing information, I have no knowledge of what happened afterwards.
Okay. Senator Feinstein.
Thanks very much. Indeed, you're a very brave man. I respect that, and I respect your loyalty to Mr. Magnitsky.
Yeah.
Having said that, Mr. Browder, it's hard for me to understand why the Magnitsky Act still sticks in the craw of Russia and what Veselnitskaya would have to do with that. That's not going to be reversed. There's no chance. And it seems to me that the Putin government would understand that. So what is the nature of that feeling, obsession, whatever you want to call it?
It's a good question. I believe that there are two reasons why why this is Vladimir Putin's single most important foreign policy priority. The first reason is, as I mentioned in my testimony, we have evidence that Vladimir Putin's nominee, Sergei Magnitsky, who's a famous cellist who was exposed in the Panama Papers, received some of the proceeds of this crime. If you remember, this is a cellist who's worth $2 billion.
Excuse me, the crime being what they took from your office.
The $230 million of taxes that we paid. He received some of that $230 million. And so Vladimir Putin, I believe, to be the richest man in the world. I believe he's worth $200 billion. That money is held all over the world in banks in America and all over. The purpose of Putin's regime has been to commit terrible crimes in order to get that money, and he doesn't want to lose that money by having it frozen. So he personally is at risk of the Magnitsky Act. It's a very personal, venal issue, which is why the first reason why he's so upset. The second reason is that in order to get that $200 billion, he's had to instruct a lot of people working for him, let's say 10,000 people working for him, to do terrible things, to arrest, kidnap, torture, and kill, to take people's properties away. And as a result, the only way he could get people to do such terrible things is to say, if you do these terrible things, there will be no consequence. You will enjoy absolute impunity. And as a result of the Magnitsky Act, he can no longer guarantee absolute impunity because all of a sudden we've created consequences in the West. And I would not understate the value of the Magnitsky Act in terms of the consequences, because not only does it freeze the assets that are held in America, but the moment that you get onto the Magnitsky list, you get put on the OFAC sanctions list, which is a Treasury sanctions list. No bank in the world wants to be in violation of Treasury sanctions. And therefore, any bank, even if it's in South Korea or Dubai, if they see somebody on the Treasury sanctions list, will close their account that day. And as a result, you basically become a financial pariah. And so it's a real consequence.
Now, where in your view does Veselnitskaya come into this?
So Veselnitskaya is the family lawyer for the Kotsev family. The Kotsev family, as I mentioned, is a Putin regime family. And the Kotsev family owns a company called Preverzone, which was identified by the Department of Justice as having received some of the money from the $230 million fraud that Sergei Magnitsky uncovered and exposed. They ended up having to defend themselves in New York, and they came with Natalia Veselnitskaya. She was the family lawyer. She came to coordinate their legal activities. And because of that, she became essentially the point person for the Russian government in America to fight the money laundering charges and to fight the Magnitsky Act. And I should point out that in fighting the money laundering charges, I estimate that the Preverzone or the Kotsev family spent somewhere between $30 and $40 million in legal fees to save $13 or $14 million that had been frozen by the Department of Justice. And so the incentive to spend that kind of money goes well beyond their own personal interests.
She was present at this meeting on June 9th. What interest do you believe she had in that meeting, and what goal did she want to achieve?
Well, it's absolutely clear the interest and the goal. The interest and the goal in that meeting was to repeal the Magnitsky Act. She said it. It's been said by people who attended that meeting, and that's the one thing that we can conclude with certainty about what happened that meeting.
Do you believe, or do you have any evidence or any knowledge that this was a quid pro quo on behalf of Putin, that if there were a repeal of the Magnitsky Act, he would do certain things?
I have no evidence or no direct knowledge. However, I do know how the Russian government behaves, and the Russian security services behave. This was a big ask, to go and ask the possible future next president of the United States to repeal a major piece of human rights legislation. They wouldn't have gone in and say, please, can you repeal this for us, without having something to offer in return. What they were willing to offer in return, I don't know. Whether that offer made any sense to the other side, I don't know. But I do know, that the KGB, the FSB, that these are the security services, they would have studied their targets carefully. They would have constructed an offer that they thought was appealing and sizable enough to be consistent with what they were asking for.
One last question about her. Has she ever worked directly for the Russian government?
Yes, she has. She has worked directly for the...
when and where?
She's worked for the FSB being the successor organization to the KGB in the Moscow region where she's from. I don't have the exact date.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Cornyn. And let me say then it'd be Kennedy, then it would be on our side, Senator Graham, and on the Democrat side, it'll be White House, Hirano, Klobuchar, and Blumenthal in the order that was given to me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Senator Kennedy for his courtesy allowing me to go next. Of course, you can't repeal a law in the United States if Congress objects. And so it's really kind of incredible that Mr. Putin would think that by talking to the son of the candidate running for president that he would be able to repeal the act, because I assure you, Mr. Browder, there is no way that Congress would agree to repeal the Magnitsky Act. I personally experienced a very minor indication of President Putin's anger at Congress and those of us who worked to pass the Magnitsky Act when I was traveling with my family and tried to go through passport control in St. Petersburg a few years ago. And while my wife and daughter made it through, I did not. That was so I have no doubt that this is personal to Mr. Putin, and he is trying to lash out at those who participated in passing it, and I'm proud that we did pass it. One thing we've learned is it's hard to distinguish between purely commercial enterprises and government in many places around the world. For example, Gazprom, Rosneft are owned by the Russian government, and many countries around the world where you have monarchies and other autocratic governments, essentially, in places like China, where you have the Communist Party, basically, that's embedded in every otherwise appearing commercial enterprise. It's impossible to separate those two. In Russia, as you point out, there are about 100 billionaires who own about a third of the country's wealth. And it's really, like I said, impossible. You don't become wealthy in Russia without being directly tied to the Russian government. And of course, many of these oligarchs have branched out of Russia and have begun to buy Western companies and commercial interests, including press and media outlets, sports clubs, manufacturing companies, financial institutions, and technology companies. And then, of course, these companies come to Congress and try to lobby us on behalf of these industries without our knowledge that they are actually representing nation states that are adverse to the interests of the American people. Should we be concerned when more concerned than we have been to this point, not just with Russia meddling in our elections, but with foreign countries around the world with interests adverse to the United States using these so-called commercial enterprises, which are nothing other than fronts for the country and the nation state? Should we be more concerned than we have been about their influence on domestic and foreign policy in the United States?
Yes, absolutely. So you've really brought up a hugely important point, especially as it relates to Russia, but as it relates to any kleptocratic regime, that in a kleptocracy like Russia and other countries, the way that the world works is that the president of that country allows certain people to get rich. He often gets a share of the wealth of those people, and then he can rely on those people to do the state's bidding in situations in which where it may not be appropriate or they may not want to show the government's face. And we've seen in Russia, it's entirely an informal system like that, where and there's absolute documentary evidence of people who have gotten rich under Vladimir Putin, who have then done lots of foreign policy work, not just in America, but all over the world, in order to further Putin's agenda, which is adverse to decency and democracy and liberal thought. And so, yes.
Well, we are obviously an open and free society, and our adversaries take advantage of that, sometimes unbeknownst to us. And do you think that these commercial entities that really are affronts for state-owned enterprises and people like Vladimir Putin should be forced to register under the Foreign Agents Registration Act and the Lobbyist Disclosure Act?
Well, it's absolutely essential that they do, and it's absolutely essential that that there's transparency about who people are talking to and what their interests are, and that's been one of the and you're right. The issue we have a free society, free press, democracy, open ideas, First Amendment, et cetera, and they're taking advantage of that. And the only way that we can fight against it and keep our free society is by having absolute transparency. If everybody knows who it is who's doing the talking, then you can then calibrate whether that person is credible and whether their interests should be taken into account if they're operating on the basis of an adversary.
Including when people come to lobby Congress, we need to know that who they're actually working for, right?
Absolutely.
Is it possible to achieve any status in Russia and be beyond Putin's reach?
No. I was somebody who tried to be totally independent, to be completely transparent, and to be completely honest, and
they ran you off.
And they threw me out of the country, killed a bunch of people, tried to steal all my money.
That's the consequences of attempting to be independent of Vladimir Putin and in Russia. You mentioned that Russian agents commonly avoid registering under the Foreign Agent Registration Act. In your opinion, how large is the community of U.S. company enablers searching to find clients interested in avoiding FARA regulation? Do you have an idea about that?
Well, I would imagine that probably a big majority of the lobbyists in Washington would be glad to take the money from Russia. I don't know how many of them would be happy not to register as foreign agents, but there's a big community of enablers and people wanting to get the business of being an enabler for Russia. I've seen lots of that here in Washington.
And while we're focused on Russia today, obviously as a result of your story and your experience, this same means can be used by any other country whose interests are not aligned with the United States government.
That's correct, and there doesn't seem to be any consequence for not registering as a foreign agent, and there doesn't seem there's no enforcement and no consequence, and so it seems to me that that's the problem.
Thank you for your courage, Mr. Browder.
Thank you.
Senator Whitehouse, and sometime if you ask me, I'll tell you why I call you Whitehurst once in a while. Maybe I better say that right now. There's a famous whistleblower by the name of Dr. Whitehurst that was an FBI agent and exposed a lot of wrong going on in the labs of the FBI, and I protected him, and he got fired, as every whistleblower does. But he did sue the FBI and got $1 million out of his work, and we got a new $40,000 lab down at the Marine Station to do the right work that the FBI lab's supposed to do.
I offer to represent Senator Whitehouse.
I'm glad to hear it's a positive association, Mr. Chairman, for you. So I just wanted to say a couple of quick things before I ask my questions. The first is that I believe that corruption is a world plague, not a local phenomenon, and I'm very grateful to you. You may have done more to fight corruption worldwide than any other individual, and I appreciate what you have done. The second is to point out, I guess Senator Cornyn is gone, but Senator Grassley and I have a piece of legislation that would require incorporation transparency so the United States doesn't become the sanctuary for international criminals and kleptocrats. It's bipartisan, and we welcome the support of any other committee members who are concerned about these commercial entities that are fronting for other folks. And third, while the President is highly unlikely to be able to undo the Magnitsky Act, I do believe that there is the power in the President to remove people off the OFAC list.
Yes.
So the Veselnitskaya approach to the Trumps had a potential goal within reach that did not require undoing the Magnitsky Act. And indeed, we are looking at rewriting the Magnitsky Act right now to close off that opportunity to make sure there is not this executive backdoor to delisting people who are listed on the Magnitsky off of the OFAC list. So can you give a capsule description of what the relationship between Putin is and his oligarchs such that the threat of sanctions to oligarchs is a threat to Putin?
That's an excellent question. So when Putin was originally fighting with the oligarchs when he first came to power because they were stealing power from him, and so in order to regain the power of the presidency, in 2003 he arrested the richest oligarch in the country, a man named Michael Khodorkovsky, the owner of Yukos. They dragged him off of his airplane, his private jet, put him on trial in Moscow. And when you go on trial in Moscow...
Talk about a reset, huh?
Indeed. When you go on trial in Moscow, there's a 99.7% conviction rate, so they put you in a cage because there's no presumption of innocence. And so they had him sit in a cage, and they allowed the television cameras to film the richest man in Russia sitting in a cage. Now imagine you're the 17th richest man in Russia, and you saw the richest guy, far smarter, far more powerful than you, sitting in a cage. What's your reaction to that? You don't want to sit in that cage. And so one by one, after Michael Khodorkovsky was convicted, these other oligarchs went to Vladimir Putin and said, what do we have to do to not sit in the cage? And he said, it's very straightforward, 50%. Not 50% for the Russian government or 50% for the presidential administration of Russia, 50% for Vladimir Putin. And so he became the richest man in the world in that moment. And
so his oligarch network is feeding him massive amounts of money and doing his political bidding, and therefore he wants to make sure that they have access to foreign accounts and so forth so they can travel and spend and save and invest in the legitimate world.
And they hold his money for him.
Got it.
And so if you want to get Vladimir Putin, sanction the top oligarchs as well.
So over and over again, when the White House issued the statement about young Donald Trump's meeting, they talked about how the discussion with Veselnitskaya was about the adoption of Russian children. On July 9th, he said the adoption of Russian children was the subject. On July 10th, they tweeted how the conversation was primarily about adoptions. Sean Spicer later on talked about the conversation about a discussion about adoption. When the president interviewed with the New York Times, he said, I actually talked about Russian adoption with Vladimir Putin. And the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, in his July 24th Intel Committee statement said he was talking about the issue of a ban on U.S. adoptions of Russian children. So, to a Russian agent or official, a conversation with an American about adoptions is a conversation really about what?
About the Magnitsky Act.
And in turn?
I'm sorry?
Well, the adoption connects it to the Magnitsky Act.
So basically,
what is the Magnitsky Act?
The Magnitsky Act was passed. Putin retaliated by banning the adoption of Russian orphans.
But the Magnitsky Act is tied to sanctions, is it not?
Indeed. So they weren't talking.
So if you're talking about adoption,
you're not talking about adoption. They were not. Nobody was talking about adoption.
Talking about children.
Nobody was talking about adoption. They were talking about the repeal of sanctions so that Russian torturers and murderers could freely travel and keep their money in America.
Adoption is, in effect, code to Russians for talking about lifting sanctions.
That's correct.
Is there any reason that anybody in the president's circle should know that?
I can't speak to their frame of mind, but
Can you imagine that they would not know that?
I don't want to put thoughts into anyone else's head, but I can say with certainty that nobody was talking about adoption.
Got it. So you have had to become kind of a sleuth of sorts to sort through a lot of this stuff. You've hired investigators. You've worked with investigators. Your book, Red Notice, describes some of that investigative work. We have a phrase here, follow the money. Yep. How important is following the money to successfully investigating Russian election influence operations?
Well, following the money is the key to all of these types of situations.
And how useful are tax returns as an investigative tool in following the money as you describe?
I'm not sure about tax returns. What I can tell you is that tracing wire transfers to organizations connected to any public or any foreign policy objectives of the Russians will tell you a lot. And just to give you an example, we traced.
And on the other side, if an American has been engaged in such transactions, and if he has truthfully filed tax returns, then the tax returns would also provide evidence of those connections, would they not?
Presumably, if the tax returns have full disclosure, then that should be an area of interest.
In the sentence in which you said that addressing these sanctions was the single most important foreign policy initiative or pursuit of Russia, you also mentioned their use of banks in America. That rang a bell with me. Why did you mention Russian use of banks in America, and what would you like us to do about Russian use of banks in America?
Well, basically, a lot of the money that comes out of Russia is money that's the proceeds of crime, and all of that money, if it's sent in dollars, goes through American banks, and so we have a great opportunity here to investigate and seize money that's the proceeds of crime, and as a national policy, I think that it should be used much more than it currently is.
We should act on that opportunity.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Senator Graham.
Well, I want to thank the ranking member and the chairman for having this hearing. Mr. Browder, thank you. It's this whole story reads like some kind of novel that nobody would buy. It's got to be fiction, but unfortunately, maybe it's true. Let's just break down sort of why you're here. You believe that Fusion GPS should have registered under FARA because they were acting on the behalf of the Russians.
That's correct.
So I just want to absorb that for a moment. The group that did the dossier on President Trump hired this British spy, wound up getting it to the FBI. You believe they were working for the Russians.
And in the spring and summer of 2016, they were receiving money indirectly from a senior Russian government official.
Okay. So these are the people that were trying to undermine Donald Trump by showing he had nefarious ties to Russia. Is that what you're saying?
Well, what I'm saying with 100% certainty is that they were working to undermine the Magnitsky Act,
right,
and the timing of that.
The Fusion GPS products, apparently, is they hired a guy to look into Trump.
Yes.
Right?
Correct.
And the guy looking into Trump was trying to tell the world that Trump's compromised by the Russians, and I won't go into graphic detail. That was the genesis. Have you looked at the report?
I have not looked at it carefully, no.
Okay, well, that's what's in the dossier. So why is this important? The Russians are behind Fusion GPS, who are going after Trump. What's the Russian lawyer's name?
Natalia Veselnitskaya.
Can I just call her Natalia?
You can call her whatever you want.
Good.
Russian
Is she working for the Russians too?
She is definitely working for the Russians, no question.
So here's the deal in June of last year. Allegedly, she is meeting with Don Jr., and the premise of the meeting was the Russian government's behind Trump, and you need to meet with these people. They can help your campaign. And Don Trump says, I love it. And they met with this lady. Is that the general idea of what happened in June?
That's apparently what was reported happened in June, yes.
So she's working for the Russians, and she's trying to communicate with her oligarch friends that the Russians are on Trump's side. We got an email to that effect.
Right, yes.
Is it common for Russia to play both sides against the middle?
Yes. So what you need to understand about the Russians is there is no ideology at all. They're just in the business of, Vladimir Putin is in the business of trying to create chaos everywhere.
So you've looked at this closer than anybody I know. You believe Fusion GPS is actually backed by the Russians. They're trying to find dirt on Trump. You believe this Russian lawyer, Natalia, is working for the Russians. She has been introduced to Don Jr. by a business partner of the Trump, saying the Russian government's behind you. They want to help you. You need to meet with this lady. That's kind of interesting. So WikiLeaks and the DNC and Podesta's email. Do you have any doubt it was the Russians who actually stole the DNC documents and Podesta's emails?
Well, I rely on the 17 intelligence agencies of the United States government.
Is that something you think they would do?
Of course. The Russians will do anything they can get away with, and even stuff they can't get away with.
All right, interesting. Do you know Paul Manafort?
I do not.
Have you ever heard of Paul Manafort?
I have.
He represented Russia's puppet in the Ukraine. Are you familiar with that?
I am indeed.
Are you familiar with his profile?
Yes.
That he was intricately involved in the Putin world.
Yes.
Do you think Russia would see him being campaign chairman for Trump as a great opportunity?
Well, I can't imagine that they wouldn't have seen it as a great opportunity if he was intimately connected to their puppet in Ukraine.
Do you think there's any chance at all that meeting in June that somebody didn't call the Russian intelligence services to explain what went on?
I'm sorry, who's calling?
Okay, the meeting in Trump Tower.
Right.
Do you think, what's the likelihood that meeting took place and the people in the meeting didn't call the Russian intelligence services about how it went?
Well, I can tell you with 100% certainty that the Russian intelligence services would have been aware of that meeting in advance as they were plotting it out. There would have been weeks spent studying how to best achieve the results in that meeting.
And the purpose of the meeting is not about adoptions, but try to get the Trump world friendly to the idea of repealing the Magnitsky Act or removing people from the list.
Yes.
You believe that's the purpose of the meeting?
I believe that was the purpose of the meeting.
I'm 100% certain that in the Trump world of June 2016, they probably didn't know that adoptions meant Magnitsky Act. Trust me, I don't think they knew that. But it was pretty clear that once you got into the meeting, what they were actually talking about.
Well, I don't know that anyone's state of mind other than the Russian state of mind.
Can you imagine this lady, this Russian lawyer, not bringing up the Magnitsky Act?
No, she brought up the Magnitsky Act. That was the only thing that she's interested. That was her main life project.
Do you think her biggest motivation was to make sure Americans can adopt Russian children, or to repeal the Magnitsky Act?
To repeal the Magnitsky Act. If you follow her Twitter feed, she never mentions adoptions once. She mentions me very negatively and the Magnitsky Act very negatively, many dozens of times.
So one of the people in the room is known by the Russian intelligence services to be friendly to their cause, Manafort.
Correct.
What's the likelihood that you have one meeting and there is no more follow-up between the Russian intelligence service and somebody who would be sympathetic to their cause?
Yeah, I don't know. It all depends on what the other side. So we know what the Russians, and I know what the Russians' intentions were. I don't know how those intentions would have been received by the other side.
Well, we know that Don Jr. said, love the idea of getting help from Russia.
Indeed, yes.
Do you think they would have sort of had one meeting and be done with all this?
I just don't know.
If he continued to love the idea of the help?
I just don't know. It all depends on what they offered in the meeting, I guess.
Thank you.
Now it's Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Browder, you have given us a first-hand insight into Putin's Russia. You are directly responsible for the passage of the Magnitsky Act, and I thank you. I join my colleagues in thanking you for your courage in appearing today also. Russia's interference with our 2016 election and connections to the Trump campaign is a tangled web, to say the least. How important do you think it is to our democracy that the Mueller investigation continues free from political pressure from the president?
Of course, I believe, based on intelligence reports, that the Russians did hack the election, and it's crucial to understand if there was any assistance on any part of any American citizen in doing that. So it's crucial.
Does it come as a surprise to you that Russian interests would collect compromising information on someone, for example, President Trump or candidate Trump, to gain leverage over that person?
So the Russian, Vladimir Putin is a former KGB agent. As I said, there's no such thing as a former KGB agent. There's only present KGB agents. In the KGB, they recruit people with no empathy and no morals. And they then train them to go out and to influence people with using one of two ways, either with bribery or with blackmail and extortion. And they figure out what you could bribe somebody with, and they figure out what people are scared of to extort or blackmail them. And so that's their modus operandi. And so it's entirely plausible that they would have looked at all people who would potentially influence leaders in America and try to figure out if they're bribable or extortable.
And that's one of the reasons that Sally Yates was fired as acting attorney general, raised certain concerns about some of Trump's campaign operatives and their dealings with Russia. Because as you described, this is a modus operandi for the Russians to collect incriminating evidence on their targets so that they can gain leverage or control over them.
This is exactly what they do. There's actually a Russian word for it. It's called kompromat, which means to collect compromising information about the target. And the Russians do that on a regular basis. They do it. They've been doing it on me for 7.5 years. They do it on everybody to try to find some way to influence the people that they want to influence.
And you mentioned that you have been a target of Putin's Russia ever since they kicked you out. And so is this a daily concern for you that you need to have security, you need to have people who are always alert to your safety and that of your family?
Yes, the Russian government has made a number of threats against my life. They've threatened me with death. They've threatened me with kidnapping. The Russian government has tried and failed 3 times to have me put on the Interpol most wanted list so I could be arrested as traveling. They've tried to extradite me from the UK where I live. They've sued me for libel. They've made movies about me. There's probably 250 people working inside of the Russian security services and law enforcement agencies on the Bill Browder story full-time, trying to destroy me in whatever way they can.
We learned this morning that it's not just the repeal of the Magnitsky Act, which it is highly unlikely that that would happen, but there certainly would be efforts to try to weaken the act and to figure out ways to get people off the Treasury's Office of Foreign Asset Control list. So are there things we can do to make sure that that kind of a loophole is not created under the Magnitsky Act?
Well, I like Senator Whitehouse's idea of making